Yes, please, yeah. I asked the kids the question, if anybody ever been in a fight. Here's the question I have for you. Has anybody ever made you feel ashamed? Hands up, seriously. Has anybody ever made you feel ashamed? We live with senses of shame, and we live with senses of those places in our lives where we feel that others we're lesser than they are. And I spoke about Jesus stepping up and saying, no, we're all equals. I'd like to explain that to you. You just heard Phyllis read to you say that if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek, right? You've heard that before. Yes. You've sat in churches, you've heard that. And we all take that to mean, I'm sorry, I'm being meek, I'm being passive, I won't retaliate. No. And Jesus said to the people who actually took that stance of, I'm sorry, I won't retaliate, he basically said, stand up for your rights. He was saying to them to do what? Those young people in all those countries this last few weeks, when they went into those squares and they stood up to the authorities of the day that were oppressing them. When they stood up to Hosni Mubarak and to the president of Tunisia, and when they're standing up to the president of Yemen and saying, no, we're not taking any more of this. We're not taking any more of this. And they weren't violent in the per se. They just said, we're not taking it anymore. We have a right to our life. Passive but direct intervention, saying we're not taking it anymore. It's the same thing that Mahatma Gandhi did when he sat down and began his fast and said, no, we're not doing this anymore. And it all comes back to Jesus saying, turn the other cheek. And here's how it works, because you're not used to the culture. So you got to understand the cultural references that were going on here. To be beaten, to be put down as a person by the Roman authorities or the religious authorities in Jesus' day meant you got a backhand. Somebody came up and they gave you, if they wanted to put you down, they gave you the backhand. Smacked you across the face with the back of their hand like you were a dog. This hand, by the way, you can't hit with. It's the unclean hand. So for somebody to hit with this brings more shame on the person who hits. Okay? So you got to use the right hand and you got to hit a backhand. If the person who you backhand stands up to you and turns the other cheek, they are now forcing you to hit them this way. And to be struck with the open hand is to be considered an equal. So if somebody backhands you, if somebody puts you down, you stand up and say, no, I'm your equal. You got to treat me like an equal and smack me the other way. In our culture, we have, it goes on to say in that passage, if somebody takes your tunic, give them your cloak. It wasn't about giving to the Salvation Army. It wasn't about generosity with my worldly possessions. People usually had two items of clothing, a tunic and a cloak. The tunic was like the sweater that you wear, or the outer clothes, and the cloak was your underwear. And in those cultures, unlike ours, in our culture it's considered shameful to be seen naked. But in Jesus' culture, it was shameful if you looked at somebody who was naked. So if you take my tunic from me and I give you my cloak, I'm forcing you to look at me naked. I'm bringing shame to you. Jesus was saying to the people, look, it It is said, an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Leave it to that God to work out whatever retributions are necessary. But I'm saying to you, you shall love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. And he's referring not to something he just made up. He's referring to in that old rule book of Leviticus that none of us like because it's got all those rules. He's saying there's one in here that's worth holding up to you, and that's love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. You are all equals in God's eyes. Now, it's remarkable because Jesus didn't usually play around with that rule book. He acknowledged it, but he also acknowledged the fact that in the Jewish code, you know, you got the 10 Commandments that became a multiplicity of laws. There's actually 625 laws to be kept, and that if you actually started to keep each one of them, you break one, because some of them contradict each other. So it's impossible to keep them all. He knew that. The Pharisees knew that. You know, we talk about organized religion in our society that has pre-programmed us to feel guilty. Guilty. You're sinners. Who wants to be a Christian? We acknowledge that I'm a sinner and that I need Jesus Christ to be my redemptive power and that I'm nothing without Jesus Christ. I am guilty and I am broken by virtue of who I am. We are programmed in the doctrines of our faith. And Jesus never said that. Jesus never came along and said, oh, you're a bunch of sinners. Jesus was about elevating people. And you all know the stories. Matthew. We're reading Matthew's book. Why would Matthew write this stuff? Anybody got an idea why Matthew wrote this stuff? Do you know who Matthew is? An apostle. But before he was an apostle, he was a thief. He was a tax collector. He was a despised individual. He was somebody considered not a first-class individual by the rest of society. He was a turncoat. He was a Hebrew person who worked for the Romans, ripping off his own people. Tax collectors in his day and age, as you've heard me say before, were people who, when Rome levied a tax, they went to these privateers that they called tax collectors and said, you get our tax for us. Tax collector would show up in your house and say, the tax is 10 denarii, but you look like you're worth about 600 denarii. I'll take 500 denarii from you in tax. I'll give Rome its 10 and keep the rest for myself. That's my cost of doing business. That's who Matthew was. Somebody his own people despised as a hated turncoat, and somebody the Romans despised because he was doing their dirty work. He was a person of no class. He was considered less than everyone else. Yet he heard a message that said, no, I am worthy of more. And it isn't my bank account that gives me my worthiness. It's my value in God's eyes. It's my belief that no matter what I've done before, I can reform and I can have a better life. I can put all those efforts to good use. And so that's what he did. He became an apostle. He became one who worked with Jesus to teach other people that we are equals in God's eyes. Every one of us has those places where we go to where we are confronted with what we consider our shame. The things that we have done in the past, the mistakes that we have made. You know, you walk into a high school reunion and the teachers walk over to you and say, I remember you. And immediately you're right back there, right? Oh yeah, I'm my last nasty act in this place. Everything else I've ever done, not remembered. Actually, one of my riding helmets actually says, the bad things I've done are long remembered, the good I do is never remembered. Or something to that effect. The bad things I do are never forgotten. The good things I do are never remembered. Because that's the way a lot of us live our lives, with that sense. People remember you for your last nasty act, not the last good thing you've done. Not for the basic good nature that you are, whether or not you do anything. You could sit at home all day like a lump on the log, watch TV, and do actually no productive good work, and God would still consider you of worth. In our society, though, we would say that person, they don't accomplish much. They're not worthy of anything. What we have to understand is that we need to see ourselves and the people around us with the eyes of a God. And you all have them. We all have the eyes of a God, because God made us in God's own image, so that we might see ourselves in the image of God, and to know that we are of worth. We are worth standing up. It is worth turning the other cheek. It is worth risking being seen in the eyes of another person, to know that our value is the love of God, which is beyond our understanding, that there is nothing that can separate us from that. We live, we have our family squabbles, we have our